Hello again, movie fans. Thought I'd go from a movie that I hated, which I did earlier tonight, to one that I love, which is 1980's Somewhere in Time, starring Christopher Reeve, Jane Seymour, and Christopher Plummer. It was directed by Jeannot Swarcz, who was also the principal director on Rod Serling's Night Gallery, amongst other things. Written by Richard Matheson from his novel A Bid Time Return, which is somewhat rare and difficult to find. At least a first edition is very difficult to find, and are now collector's items. Very beautiful love story and time travel story, which is really interesting, and terrific acting from all three of the principal leads. Jane Seymour at her absolute loveliest, which is saying quite a lot. I think she's still stunning even now. Um, uh, and it's a marvelous story. A man, Christopher Reeve, is a playwright, and it starts in 1972. He's just produced a play, like a college play, and it's gotten some good reviews. One of the reviewers is William H. Macy, and he's saying how much he liked the play, and he thinks it can go on to Broadway. And suddenly, a very old, white-haired woman approaches this playwright, Richard Collier, and presses a pocket watch into his hand, an old-fashioned wind-up, pocket watch, and says, "Come back to me." And then she just walks off. And he doesn't understand what that means or who she is. And someone says, do you know her? He says, "No, I've never met her before in my life." Disappears. We see her go into an apartment and close the door, a very elegant apartment. And her maid asks her, "Are you all right?" And she doesn't really reply, but she holds the play in her hand, copy of Richard's play in her hand, and smiles. And that's the last that we see of her for the moment. It cuts to 8 years later. He is now a very successful playwright. He's written something like 10 plays, and some of them have gotten Tony Awards. And he's trying to write a new one, and he's got writer's block, and he just tears the sheet out of the typewriter and curls it up and throws it away, and he's very frustrated. He goes down in the elevator from his very elegant Chicago apartment, and he's got a suitcase with him, and the elevator operator says, "Where are you going?" He says, "I don't know." And he says, "Well, what about your play?" He says, "It's not done yet." He says, "People are waiting for that play." He says, "I know." He's like very frustrated. And he's just driving, and you see him, start out on a Chicago freeway, and then he ends up somewhere on sort of a kind of an old country road, and he passes by a place called the Grand Hotel. Grand Hotel is where we saw the old woman return to, actually, in the first scene. That is on Mackinac Island in Michigan. And he ends up there, and just for some reason he stops and he pulls in and checks into the hotel. And he's kind of talking to the bellhop, a guy named Arthur, and Arthur looks at him and says, "Have we met before?" And he says, "No, we've never met. I don't know who you are." And that's kind of a clue as to what's going to happen later. He's waiting around for dinner, and he asks the sommelier, "When is dinner going to be served?" And he says, "About 40 minutes. He says, 40 minutes? And he's hungry now. He wants to eat. So he's walking around. There's something called the Hall of History. And he's looking at sort of old artifacts and registers and some of the old, silverware and things that they used back in the turn of the century. And Arthur had told him that he'd been there since 1910 when he was a little boy, and that his father used to get mad at him for playing ball in the lobby. And then he's looking around and he sees this photograph, and there's no name on it, but of a very beautiful young woman, and he's kind of smitten. He's like totally entranced and fixated by this photograph. And sort of like in Laura, he falls in love with her image before he actually knows the person. And he talks to Arthur about it and says, "Who's that woman who's in the photograph in the Hall of History? There's no name." He says, "Oh, that's Elise McKenna. She was a very famous actress at the time. She appeared in a play here back in 1912. And he goes to, he was only going to stay for one night. He was just, sort of had to get out of Chicago. And he tells Arthur after that, "I put my bags back in my room." He's going to stay. And he asks him, "Where's the local library?" And he tells him. goes to the library and starts looking up information about this actress, Elise McKenna, reads about her life and that she lived to be a very, old woman and became very famous and, was the first real, screen idol, as it were, stage idol, of her time. But she kind of became a recluse after 1912, and nobody really knows why. Just that something tragic occurred in her life. And she didn't talk about it. So he's looking up information about her, and he sees one of the items that he meets her, the one who was her maid, and asks about her, and she isn't going to let him in, and then he shows her the pocket watch. She says, "Where did you get that? That was her pocket watch." He says, "Someone gave it to me." And he says, she never parted with that. It disappeared on the night she died. He said, "Well, that was the night that she came to my play." And then she lets him in and lets him see some of her, costumes and some things from her theater career. And one of them is a book that she liked to read. It's called Travels Through Time. And it's apparently a book about time travel. And he goes and meets the person who wrote the book at a university in Chicago and asks him, is time travel possible? And he says, "Well, that's a very interesting question." And he tells him about an experiment that he conducted where he got rid of basically everything modern in a room that he was in and dressed up in period costume from I think he said 1852. And, put like lamps and everything was from the same period. And he believes that he convinced himself that it was 1852, and just for a moment that he woke up in 1852. And then it put a lot of strain on him, and he came back, and he was back in the modern time. And he said, "Well, do you think I could do that?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. You can try, but I can't guarantee you, any success. But I know one thing. If I was going to do it again, I'd make absolutely certain there was nothing at all modern in the room." And so Christopher Reeve becomes obsessed with this idea, and he goes back to, he goes out and buys himself the play that was put on by Elise McKenna occurred in 1912, June 27th, I think, 1912. So or June 28th, I think. And he's going to go back to June 27th. And he starts trying to convince himself. He buys a set of clothing from the period, a bowler hat, and a kind of a rather ugly brown suit, and a straight bow tie. And he has the pocket watch, and he goes to a coin dealer, a rare coin dealer, and gets coins from 1912 and gets rid of all of his modern coins. And anything he gets rid of all the modern equipment out of his hotel room, puts his TV set in the closet, and puts a modern painting in the closet, puts modern lamps and things in the closet, puts anything that would have been out of place in 1912 away, except for this tape recorder that he has with the tape, trying to convince himself that it's saying, it's not June 28th, 1912, it's 6 p.m., I'm going to wake up and it's going to be June 9th. He keeps trying this night after night. It's not working. He's not traveling back in time. Finally, and I don't know why it took him so long to twig to this, he gets rid of the tape recorder, and he's just doing it in his mind. He convinces himself in his mind that he's gone back in time, and then it works. And he wakes up, and it's June 27th, 1912. And he tries to meet Elise McKenna, but she is protected by her rather obnoxious manager, who is played W.F. Robinson, played by Robertson, I think, played by Christopher Plummet, who's very protective of her and is kind of an ass, really. Won't let any man near her. A, because he wants her himself, which is rather obvious, and B, because he wants her to be a star, and he thinks that any romantic involvement would distract her from her career, and he doesn't want that, and he's willing to go to rather extreme lengths, as we find out later, to protect her. He tries to meet her. Everybody tells him that, she's not there, she's rehearsing, she's doing this, she's doing that. Finally, someone says, "Well, you should try down by the walk. She likes to walk down by the river." And he sees her, and this is a very good to see. She was shot through kind of a gauzy haze, maybe through like a gauze over the lens, and then so it's a gauzy, and then they sharp focus. And I thought that was a good editing move to do that. He sees her and she says, "Is it you?" And he says, "Yes." And then the Christopher Plummer walks in and says, "Who are you? Leave Miss McKenna alone, or I'll have you ejected from the hotel." And becomes very obnoxious and sort of pushes him away. And he asks her, "Why did you say, is it you?" And she says, "I don't have to tell you that." Mysteriously walks away. Now he's very frustrated. He doesn't know what to do. He's trying to see her desperately, and he can't really do anything except follow along behind, kind of like a puppy dog. And of course, Christopher Plummer is very annoyed at this, and he hasn't checked into the hotel yet. I should make a note of that. So he's trying to dance with her at dinner, and again, there's various obstacles, and he does dance with her briefly and says, "I know everything about you." And she says, "You can't possibly know everything about me. You just met me, And he says, "Well, if I just met you, why did you ask me, are you the one?" And she won't answer him. And then Christopher Plummer interjects and says, "This man is an intruder. He's not registered in the hotel," and they throw him out. He ends up sleeping on the porch on a rather uncomfortable wicker sofa. And then in the morning, he registers in the hotel. And he had looked at a register. He asked Arthur, Arthur told him, "If you need anything, come see me. I live in a shack behind the hotel." And he wakes him up in the middle of the night and says, "Arthur, where did you find those objects in the Hall of History?" And he says, "Well, they're from up in the attic." He goes up in the attic and finds the hotel register from 1912, and his name is in it. So he knows he was actually there. And he knows what room he was in. So he registers, and at first they give him a different room, and he says, "Are you sure this is the right one?" And they say, "Oh, that room," the other clerk says, "that room was reserved, and I forgot to put a note in the keyhole." And so they give him the right room. The one that he had seen himself in was room 416. And the desk clerk registers him in the same way he saw it in the original book. Also, he meets Arthur as a young boy, and he's playing ball in the lobby, and his father is just chiding him. And he secretly sneaks the ball back to him, which I thought was really nice. That was a good touch, I thought, in the movie. Anyway, he starts becoming romantically involved with Jane Seymour, and he's much to the ire of Christopher Plummer, who is still trying to protect her. She leaves him a ticket for the play, and he goes and sees the play, and she changes the opening act to reflect the fact that she hasn't met the person she really loves, and she starts talking about it. She's like improvising the whole scene. Everybody in the audience loves it, and Christopher Plummer is very perplexed, doesn't know what the heck she's doing, but suspects. And there's a scene where he and Richard and Elise are walking down on the beach, and it looks almost exactly like a scene from Monet's painting Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which is Lunch Amongst the Trees. And I think that's intentional. Wonderful soundtrack by John Barry. The theme song for Somewhere in Time was by someone named Roger Williams, and it also plays heavily on Rachmaninoff's symphony on a variation from Puccini, which I think it's an interesting lilting sort of love song, which plays underneath a lot of the scenes. Really lovely soundtrack. Set decoration was fantastic. It was done by a lady named Marianne Biddle, and she did a fantastic job because everything looks very period. People keep making fun of Christopher Reeve's suit, and they say it's 10 years out of date, and one person says it's 15 years out of date. So even though he did his research, he apparently, he went back too far as far as the suit was concerned. And ironically, that's what's his undoing, because he says, "I like this suit. So, you've got the vest, and it slips on, and the sleeves fit, and there's a special inside pocket for coins," and he reaches in, and there's a penny from 1979. And this is during the most romantic scene where he's, well, one of the most romantic scenes. I won't spoil what the other one is for you, but um, and then he vanishes back into modern time, and the last thing we see is Elise yelling Richard, and he vanishes. Uh, he tries to get back to her, and for some reason he can't. And I think it's simply because that coin, that penny just spoiled it, and he can't. For some reason, he can't unspoil it. Then we see a scene at the end where he has gone back to the hotel. He's older, but he's not old. He's, I'd say, about 45, 50 maybe. But apparently he hasn't been eating, and he just sort of slips off into a coma. And Arthur comes in and finds him, the older Arthur now, comes in and finds him, and he's completely unresponsive. And the last thing we see, they're trying to save his life, and a doctor gives him an injection. And the last scene you see is that Elise appears on sort of a cloud, and he is now back with her, back in his 1912 suit, and they embrace, and that's the end, and the end credits roll. And I think the implication is that he died and he met her in heaven, or that she was his heaven in some ways. I'm not sure if that's exactly what Matheson meant, or if he had simply found a different way to travel back in time. Um, so it's very interesting. A very, very, very romantic movie. Wonderful. Jane Seymour is absolutely stunning, and gives a fantastic performance, even though she's really not in the movie for that long. Very good acting by Christopher Reeve, pre-Superman even. And Christopher Plummer is wonderful as always. He always plays a marvelous character, whether he's a good guy or a bad guy. He's always memorable, and I highly recommend it.